More often than not these days, school levies in Ohio school districts fail.
Property owners saddled with higher assessments often say they can't handle the increases.
And while Ohio school districts are on a roller coaster ride, districts in Kentucky and Indiana are more stable.
Tonight, we look at why and whether there's a better way to fund our schools.
From Local 12 News, Funding Ohio Schools, a search for solutions. Now, your hosts, Paula Toti and Chelsea Sick.
Good evening. In comparison to other states, both changing how Ohio schools are funded and improving that funding is often a puzzle.
Tonight, our goal is to help you understand how it works and hear from experts on what could make it better. Ohio's system for funding schools has been getting major overhauls since the 70s.
But a court mandate to distribute money fairly to all students has often fallen short, and we find ourselves at a critical moment.
Since the 1820s, Ohio has used property taxes to fund public schools. After the Great Depression, sales tax revenue was added for the first time. To reduce the burden to homeowners, in 1975, lottery proceeds went into the funding mix, and other forms of betting figure in a small way today. Economist and consultant Howard Fleeter in Columbus has made a living tracking the flow of school dollars.
We provide a lot of services at the local level that other states provide at the state level, and this is always how we've been. And so, ever since I've been here, our local taxes have always been around the top third of the country, and our state taxes have already been around the bottom third, and when you put them together, we're about in the middle.
What was considered an over-reliance on property taxes to fund schools was an issue that made it to the Ohio Supreme Court in 1997. The case known as DeRolf versus State of Ohio led to a roadmap we have today. The court said the state needed to kick in more money for education. We traveled to Columbus, where the Ohio School Board Association says the state has done that.
I am not a legal scholar, but I will tell you that I think the formula that we have on the books today is the closest to being constitutional when followed that we've had in a while.
But in the DeRolf case, the court said the state also needed to do a better job of making sure funding to all students was more equitable. How to do that has been a work in progress.
Every one of these models that we've used, whether or not it's adequate, is dependent on using the most current data and fully funding the formula, right? That those two things, and it's always been a struggle to get those two things done at the same time.
So remember, I said what we have now is a roadmap. That map can go in several directions. To be fair to all students, you have to figure out what it costs to educate each student, some with special needs, some in districts hard-pressed to contribute large sums, and districts with different transportation needs. All those things and more can become political.
What happened 4 years ago?
4 years ago, the legislature put in place the Fair School Funding Formula, which was that new formula that looks at what it costs to educate a student and then figuring out state and local share based upon a formula with income and property values.
Ohio is 4 years into a 6-year plan to complete the fair funding formula.
Do you see that happening in the new budget?
It's hard to say, right? There's a lot of uncertainty.
I do think that we're close to getting it right if people have the wherewithal to follow through with that.
But Fleeter, for one, worries lawmakers will move off the path and also see the DeRolf case as last century. For instance, school vouchers were first designed for students who were attending low-performing public schools or from low-income families as a way to make things more equitable. Now those restrictions are largely removed or relaxed.
By my math, in FY24, almost 83% of the students in private schools were getting vouchers.
As for the future, some of what's happening at the State House, Fleeter says, is a full circle moment. Like the 1970s, there's significant talk about relieving the burden of high property taxes in light of soaring home prices. But some of the fixes being talked about have many involved in education worried.
If you ask me what has changed the most in the 30 plus years I've been working on this, right, is that I am seeing less support from the state legislature for public schools than I used to see when I started doing this.
And he worries about the future support from taxpayers who may have levy fatigue. No other state, he says, has even a tenth of the levies seen in Ohio. From 1984 through last year, a whopping 10,341.
Yeah, a huge number. And in just a bit with our guests, we're going to take a closer look at why Ohio has an especially high number of levies, and some fear in the future there will be an increase in the number of levies that fail.
Tonight's roundtable discussion is in two parts. A little later, we'll be talking with state lawmakers. But right now, we want to introduce you to the people on the front lines of these school funding challenges. Eve Bolton is currently the vice president of the Cincinnati School Board, where she has served for the past 17 years.
And Dr. Michael Sander is superintendent of the Franklin schools. He's been in education for 43 years, including time as superintendent in both the Erlanger-Ellesmere and Clinton-Massey districts.
And Jennifer Wagner is currently the treasurer for the Cincinnati Public Schools. She's a CPA and has been with the district for more than 30 years, the last 10 as treasurer. One reason for the timing of this program is that Ohio lawmakers have been in the process of finalizing the budget. In it, some argue more money is going to Ohio schools when you look at the big picture.
Yeah, but others say less money is going toward the fair funding formula or public schools and diverts more money to vouchers for private schools, as we heard. And so I'm going to start with that. I'm going to ask Eve, you rolled your eyes when you heard the word 80%, or the comment there, 80% of the vouchers now going to these private schools. And is that one of your bigger fears?
It's one of our biggest fears, very frankly, because the original intent, as you all pointed out, was to give choices to those families that were interested in leaving the public schools and going and using vouchers, and perhaps because their schools where they were not delivering the outcomes that those families wanted. But that's no longer what we have with universal vouchers. And the reality is, since we've lost the original intent, you have that 80% number that you talked about, but what we're doing is actually building with public money two completely separate systems. And we are reducing the amount of money for our public school system and each of our public school children, and increasing it regarding vouchers and for voucher students.
And out in those more suburban districts, Franklin schools, how are vouchers really impacting you? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, we have 200 students taking advantage of vouchers in Franklin City Schools right now. The average income in Franklin City Schools is $41,000 per household. The average income for students receiving vouchers is $171,000. So that makes it difficult for those that are high poverty to be able to take advantage, because those private schools are also raising tuition. So they're going to have to make a gap up between what the voucher pays for and what the tuition of the school is.
And you thought, though, if you have vouchers and these kids go to private schools, then that's one less person you have to educate in the public school system.
As long as they stay in that school. Many times we find them returning to us mid-year because they're unhappy or because situations happen. And we're still responsible for providing transportation for those students.
Yeah. We knew you would not be in favor of vouchers, but to be fair, everyone we spoke with on vouchers, they don't all feel the same way. Professor Vladimir Kogan at OSU puts it this way.
I think it's a difficult issue. I think there's definitely trade-offs. It's not obvious that if you spent less on vouchers, that money would go to the schools instead. It could go to Medicaid, or it could go to income tax cuts. And so I think framing it as one versus the other is not, I think, the reality of how budgeting works in Ohio.
I think he's saying that vouchers are here to stay, and we have to deal with them.
And I'm not afraid of vouchers. I mean, I think competition is good. I'm very proud of our students and what they achieve when they're in Franklin City Schools. It's just a hard financial situation. Anytime you drain public money away from public education, it makes it more difficult, and it actually puts more burden on the local taxpayer to fund that gap.
All right, well, just as vouchers may be a new reality, so is the number of school levies, as we've been saying. And again, Ohio does really stand out.
It does. Public school districts across the country use a combination of state, local, and federal dollars to fund their schools, but it is up to each individual state to create a formula and allocate funding to the school districts. Let me break down the differences in how Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana fund their schools.
The Education Data Initiative says the federal government provides about 14% of funding for public K-12 education. The rest is funded by state and local dollars. This is how Ohio does it.
It's about half and half on average between local property taxes and state funding, but that varies dramatically across districts. In some districts, high wealth districts, high property wealth districts, most of that funding comes from local property taxes. And in really poor districts with really low poverty, with really low property wealth, disproportionately it comes from state funding.
Ohio taxpayers are voting on school levies more than taxpayers in Indiana and Kentucky. Indiana University's Dr. Michelle Moore says in Indiana, schools are funded with state dollars, mainly from sales and income taxes, as well as through local property taxes.
And those basically are 2 or 3 levies, depending on the district. So you're going to have an operations fund levy, which is going to pay for the overhead of your district, so to operate it, utilities, buses, things like that. Then you'll also have what we call a debt service levy, and that is to do building improvements or to build new buildings. And then some districts in Indiana will pass a referendum, and it'll either be an operating or a capital referendum, and those are actually approved by the voters, and they're going to be outside of the Indiana tax caps, which are 1% for homeowners.
And so levies aren't something that go to the taxpayers here in Indiana?
Unless it's part of a referendum, no.
Referenda aren't all that common. In May, Indiana taxpayers only voted on 7 referenda in the entire state. On the other hand, Ohio had 95 districts asking for additional or renewal dollars. The difference comes from a bill passed in Columbus a half-century ago.
I think the reason why we have this system is in the 1970s, property taxes, property values were going through the roof, and senior citizens were losing their homes because they were on a fixed income. And so this was a way to essentially de-link property tax payments from really sharp increases in property values to really protect people on a fixed income. And so unless, I think it's hard to come up with a better system that tries to balance all these considerations.
Kentucky funds its schools with an allocation formula.
It's an equalization between local property taxes and state funding. So the more money that a district can generate in local taxes because of property values, the less money they get from the state.
School districts automatically levy a tax rate against the property values in their community.
They're allowed to take up to a 4% increase in revenue. It's not a 4% increase in the rate, it's a 4% increase in the revenue.
If the district levies the tax rate above the 4%, voters can recall it, but that's very rare. Districts can also add a 3% utility tax, but it is subject to recall by voters.
So instead of the levy system where all the voters approve it on the front end, it's approved unless the voters basically recall it.
Another major difference amongst the states, Kentucky schools are partially funded based on student attendance, while Ohio and Indiana use enrollment numbers.
Now, this is not to say Ohio school districts don't benefit at all when property values increase. It comes down to inside millage, a school district's piece of the money allocated by townships and cities, and outside millage approved by voters. When property values go up, districts only get more money from the inside millage. So we really want to talk about levy fatigue here in Ohio. Obviously, all of you are educators here in Ohio, but I know you had some time in Kentucky as well. So kind of fill us in. I know in Franklin, you all are dealing with what seems like levy fatigue there.
Yes, we have not passed a new bond money levy since 2014, and so even to get renewals to renew levies, we failed a renewal a couple years ago, and then we had to go back to another levy, and then we came back and passed that, but then new money back in March of this past year, and then we just did May of this year. And it's exhausting. It's absolutely exhausting. And when we're talking about a chance to say no to higher taxes and the high inflation we're having, you can't blame people for being against higher taxes because they're having trouble making ends meet.
Yeah, I think Chelsea had a good point when you were talking about inside millage. So people see their home values go up, their taxes did go up. Even if the outside millage didn't change, the inside millage is giving more money to schools. So how do you answer taxpayers who say you got more money?
And indeed, the fatigue issue is crucial. But what is really scariest about it is that eventually many of our districts, we have 22 public school districts just in Hamilton County, and many of those districts will not be able to survive this next decade because the people that are in those districts will not be able to assume that kind of responsibility in their property taxes. So this is a crisis for real, because people in Ohio have actually enjoyed local control, local autonomy, and they insist upon it. But the reality is, because unlike Indiana and Kentucky, as you point out, the state of Ohio has not assumed the full responsibility that it needs to.
We have a couple lawmakers here in this room with us. What do you really want them to know as we go into this next part of this town hall?
So just help with supporting the funding formula and doing some research on how to lessen the reliance on property taxes, because it does appear inequitable across the state.
Allow us to maintain our autonomy, whether it's curriculum or finances. I think that's crucial. It's what Ohioans expect. And the other piece is, besides the fair funding, fully funded, it's very important that we maintain the investments that our taxpayers have made in our buildings and in all of the things that we have to provide for our students.
And with the fair school funding formula, I think it's key to input, update the inputs.
Yes.
You can't update the property values and the income of the local residents without the income of without updating the expense of what is to educate a child. I think that's really the big key.
With that, we will be right back. And welcome back. The people tasked with fixing or improving Ohio schools are our legislators, and 2 state representatives have agreed to join us tonight. Representative Adam Byrd is no stranger to the topic of funding public education. Before he got into politics, he spent many years as a teacher and as an administrator in the public schools. He serves on both the House Education and Finance committees.
Representative Dunny Isaacson is the minority whip in the Ohio House and serves on the House Finance Committee. One issue important to address with our new panel, we have declining enrollment in Ohio. So it seems fair to ask why there isn't more money available for each student. Whoever wants to kind of start.
Yeah, when we were kids, we never heard the crisis. Well, I'll just say when I was a kid that there was constantly a crisis. Now we actually have a declining enrollment. So it seems that you would have more money for schools, not less.
Well, I would argue that around 2000, the state of Ohio, actually schools in Ohio, were spending around $8,000 per pupil across the state of Ohio. And we're now double that. And in 2023, 2024 data, we're spending $17,000 on average per child in the state of Ohio. So there's been a lot of additional support that's been given to schools.
When we talk about we need to grow the state, Ohio should be the best state in the country to raise a family. I think we all want that and agree on that. But we're not putting our money where our mouth is on that issue because we're underfunding dramatically our public schools. And that has been a trend that has gone on for the last 25 years. But I will say we finally made some progress in a bipartisan way 5 years ago with the passage of the Fair School Funding Formula, and multiple Republican administrations and Republican-led legislatures have passed a bipartisan Fair School Funding Formula until this year, when the Republican majority abandoned the Fair School Funding Formula in the House-passed budget and reverted back after so much work had gone into finally getting our schools on track, reverted back to a system that had failed for decades. And so that is sort of the fight we're in, which is what is the role of the state in funding public education and making sure that there is adequate funding to provide excellent, high-quality schools for every kid in Ohio. And right now, the legislature is just choosing to fail to live up to that need.
Paul, I might say that those are some excellent talking points, which is why I actually used data when I talked about the way we have increased our funding for schools over the last 20 years. And that continues. And so he mentions the Fair School Funding Formula that was passed 4 or 5 years ago. We all know that past General Assemblies can't commit the future General Assemblies to any particular expenditure. And if we had done what that said, it would have been an additional $1.6 billion towards schools. And that is unsustainable.
Okay.
And we heard from Dr. Sander, he had concerns about the cost of educating a student versus those property values that are going up, and that was his concern with the formula. He really wanted to hear from you all on his thoughts on that. What do you have to say?
High property taxes are a choice that the legislature makes. It is a policy choice to put more of that burden on property owners. We could choose differently. We could fund our schools from different sources. We could have the state step up and pay more of its fair share. My colleague, who I have tremendous amounts of respect for and work well with, but we have some reasonable differences of opinion here, mentioned some numbers. We can dive into them. $550 million more than the governor proposed in the House-passed budget. Most of that money, and this is emblematic of the problem overall, most of that $550 million is going towards private schools and charter schools, which are concentrated in the big cities. So most people in Ohio don't get to see that investment. And when we talk about that $17,000 total amount per pupil, that is not the amount the state is paying. That is the amount overall that's getting spent. So in a lot of districts, including here in Cincinnati and in the surrounding areas, most of that money is coming on the back of local property owners. So the choice that the state makes is what share should they pay, what percentage, and we are at an unconstitutionally low percentage of state share. It should be at 50-50. That's what fair would be. 50% on the state, 50% on local communities. When the Supreme Court in Ohio ruled in 1997 that we have an unconstitutional funding system, we were at a 42% state share. They said that's unconstitutionally low. We are lower than that today, and the House-passed budget would take us even lower. So that, as we think about property taxes, we should not be funding our schools by taxing people out of their homes.
Okay, would you agree with that? Because you said voters do not want to spend more on property taxes.
They don't. We should not be taxing grandmother and grandfather out of their home based on high property taxes. And so I heard one of the panelists before talk about property taxes and that they are voted on and they should be able to keep those because they've been voted on by the by the voters. But that is not completely accurate because the voters have to, the property tax valuation spikes that all of Ohio has experienced over the last couple of years has artificially risen people's property taxes in ways that they didn't vote for.
What can you both agree on to move this ball forward and make sure that we have the best schools we can have in Ohio? And like you said, what is enough? I don't know what enough is. I don't know if any state knows what enough is, but what can we do to make it the best it can be?
Well, I think the representative mentioned accountability. I think that is a fair comment. I can agree with him that schools that are getting voucher dollars need to be held accountable for that, and there needs to be a way of testing those students to make sure that those students are growing to where they need to be, just like kids that are in the public schools.
We've seen charter schools fail, and they've gotten voucher dollars, and we need accountability. Would you say that that's a good start?
I think we definitely agree on that. And I think there are areas of overlap. I am not here to say that I don't think that there's folks in the majority who care about kids. Of course there are and who care about schools. I think the representative is one of them and has been doing it his whole career. But I do think we have to be honest about the choices we make in the legislature and the real impact it has. And when we put hundreds of millions of dollars towards stadiums for billionaires, when we cut income taxes for the highest earners in the state that they didn't ask for, we are starving ourselves of the resources we need to fully invest in our schools. And we have to start with the premise, which is what the Fair School Funding Formula does, of what does it actually cost to educate a child? How much do we pay teachers? How much do the textbook costs? And we've seen huge amounts of inflation over the last few years that continue. And if the state legislature doesn't step up and adjust how much we're spending to account for those additional expenses, then it falls on the back of taxpayers. And that's why you see levy after levy. And so those levies and the over property taxation is a result of the choices or the failure to make choices of the legislature, which has, for better or for worse, been under single party rule for a while.
So what I would also agree with the representative when he talks about that issue of what does it cost to educate a child? That's a legitimate question. And what does it cost to educate a child in urban Ohio versus rural Ohio? And there's a wide variety of differences. There are some schools in Ohio that are educating a child at the neighborhood of $30,000 per child. There are others that are educating children at $10,000 or less per child. And so what's the difference there? And is the state of Ohio responsible for making up the difference for a school district that can't seem to get it done for some price that's near the average of $17,000?
Do either of you fear that anything coming down from the federal government is going to make the challenge even bigger, that there'll be less federal dollars? It used to not be controversial, the thought that we were just going to keep getting money from the federal government. Now that does not seem to be the case.
Well, what I'm hearing is that we're going to continue to get the dollars from the federal government that we got before, but they'll be coming without strings attached. And so that's really important, because one of your graphics before showed that our schools are getting 10 to 14% of their budget from the federal government, and that's a lot, and we need to continue to get that.
Not only is there chaos right now in DC, no one knows what we're getting, when we're getting it, how we're getting it, which makes it hard to plan the summer programming, the after-school efforts that a lot of the federal funding goes towards. But also, a lot of these families in our schools are reliant on Medicaid, CHIP, and other federally funded health programs. And I hear from schools all the time, what are our kids and their families going to do when Medicaid or Medicare, depending on the family, is cut? And so these things have ripple effects that are coming out of DC, and when you take a hatchet to the services that a lot of people all over the state, in rural areas and urban areas and suburban areas in equal measure, rely on, it's gonna be devastating for schools. And so I think people are really just unsure because of the chaos, but they're scared about what the cuts could mean for them.
Obviously, I don't think there's chaos, and I think that there is finally not chaos, actually, and we're seeing some progress. And when you look at what Americans think about what's going on in DC, there's a lot of positive feedback about what they're seeing.
Thank you both so much for being here this evening. We didn't think we would necessarily reach any conclusions tonight, but we hope this at least helped you at home understand a little bit better the challenges school board superintendents and lawmakers all face.
Yeah, we appreciate your passion and wanting to be here tonight. I think we can agree on that. And I want to thank Chelsea for the work you do all year long in following all issues education-wise for the station. So very important. We're going to have a lot more of these discussions coming up, and that's very important. So.
And we want to thank our panelists for their time and their commitment to try and make public education work for every child in Ohio.
If you missed any part of tonight's program or want to see it again, you can find it on Local 12's YouTube channel. Thank you all for watching, and good night.